You've tuned into Radio Northern Beaches. We live stream on rnb.org.au across the northern beaches of New South Wales, Australia and all over the world. You can also catch us local on 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Our podcasts are available at your convenience at rnb.org.au or rnbpodcast.com.au. So you and your friends don't miss any episodes. Don't forget to follow and share. Now here's our latest podcast.
Thank you for joining us again on Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live, www.rnb.org.au. The program's Oz Music. I'm Michael Lester. We enjoy these programs and insights into all the genres and history of Australian music that we provide on our program. You can find us on Mixcloud. If you just Google Michael Lester Mixcloud, you can find hundreds of programs, and you can find us on Radio Northern Beaches podcasts. Music, of course, is everywhere with us, part of our daily lives, our enjoyment, our identity, a feeling of belonging. It's so important to us, and so it has been to people ever since the dawn of humanity. And today we're going to discuss the most wonderful book that takes us through this history. It's called The Shortest History of Music, and it's by Australia's the most acclaimed and celebrated presenter of music on radio, broadcaster Andrew Ford, who's been presenting his very erudite and insightful and enjoyable music show on ABC radio for over 30 years now, I think. And importantly, Andrew is not only a broadcaster about music and has a passion, he has an incredibly deep knowledge built up over a life in music. As a very successful and acclaimed composer himself, he knows what music is all about. He's obviously drawn all those years in presenting this breakneck ride at a thrilling pace through thousands of years of history of music around the world. And so delighted to have the opportunity to talk with you, Andrew. Thanks for joining us on Radio Northern Beaches.
It's a pleasure, Michael.
Andrew, your book, Music, The Shortest History of Music, is published by Black Ink 2024. What approach have you adopted in this book? It's a historical approach, but it's not chronologic, it's thematic.
Well, you can't do it chronologically because where would you start? As you sort of suggested in your introduction, music has been around forever, possibly even before the dawn of humanity, but we don't know anything about it. There are a few clues at which we can make guesses. There is a bone flute, which is about 42,000 years old, that was found in a cave in Germany, but we don't know what it sounded like and we don't know what it played. The thing about prehistory is that there are ruins out there that we can look at, and there are cave paintings or wall paintings that we can study and we can learn things from, including about music, actually. And there are ancient manuscripts or hieroglyphs, that we can attempt to interpret. But as for the music, it's gone. We can't hear it. So there's nothing really even to guess at apart from some pictures and some early notation. But the notation is tantalizing, but it doesn't really tell us very much. I'm talking about Mesopotamia, about 3,500 years ago. And the wall paintings show us, well, I mean, if you look at, say, ancient Egyptian wall paintings, you can see there are musicians there. They're women. You can see that they're women, and you can see the instruments that they're playing, but the instruments don't exist and the music doesn't exist. So in terms of history, it's really only history if there's evidence. And if there isn't evidence, it's guesswork. So that meant that it was really impossible to know where to start chronologically. And the other thing is that, the world is a big place. And in agreeing to write this book, because it certainly wasn't my idea, it's part of a series that Black Ink does, Shortest Histories, I thought it has to be the shortest history of all music, as a phenomenon. And so if you're doing it chronologically, which country are you looking at? Do you have to keep jumping around saying, meanwhile, in India, this was happening? Or, it's impossible. So I thought what we've got to do is to come up with the important themes in music. That's not quite the right word. But one of the things that music
has always...
It is a nice pun, yeah. One of the things that music has always done is be part of a tradition. And I think we can assume that tradition began when music began.
this pervasive music over the centuries and across cultures. You describe, I think, at one point music as syncretic, meaning I think that you find that over the centuries and millennia even, and across geographies and history, that music style and culture has fused. And this implies a certain continuity and perhaps even evolutions.
I mean, one of the things that I learnt from writing the book, and I was a bit surprised about, was how music travelled from early times, from, almost prehistory times, because we like to think we live in this global world now, thanks to the internet, everybody's connected to everybody else, and that previously, we all lived in our own caves and didn't know what was happening over the hill, let alone in another continent. But actually, there's plenty of evidence to show that instruments travelled, and that with them sometimes music travelled, songs travelled. There was trade, there was diplomacy, there was slavery, and music went with the traders and the enslaved peoples to other countries. And of course, it changed along the way. That kind of binds it all together. I mean, that makes it possible to speak about the music of the whole planet in a sense, because although depending upon where you are and what moment in history, music has different functions, there are things that connect it together. And I think, if there's one theme in the book that runs through it, it's that music happens at the most private and domestic level in society, a parent singing to a child, and also at the most public and grand levels of society. If you look at these cave paintings or wall paintings, at least, music is being performed for kings and queens and gods. So it covers the whole of our experience, and that seems to be universal too. But you've got to be careful when you talk about this, because you end up with that dreadful cliche that music is a universal language, and it isn't. Because we don't all understand music in the same way. We can all think of music that we can't abide, or possibly would actually dispute that it was music. And it's not a language either, because if it were, you could translate it into German, but you can't. And you can't say anything precise in it. You can't write a shopping list in music. So, but it is ubiquitous.
Music is ever changing across time and across places. You could say it's evolving, and whether it's developing, I suppose, is a metaphysical, philosophical question. But there is this continuity. Let's consider traditional music, which you do. What was the form and function and meaning of traditional music? And particularly, for example, you speak about Australian Indigenous music.
Well, he does lots of things. I mean, it's very, very hard and probably dangerous to generalize about any functions in music. But, I mean, we know, for example, that the didgeridoo goes back 1,000 years, which is not very far when you consider that Indigenous people have been on this continent for 60 to 70,000 years. But the reason we can't take it back any further is that wood rots, and so we haven't got any archaeological evidence beyond that. But it probably goes back further, but we don't know for sure, and you have to be sure if it's going to be history. I also read this wonderful book by the Gaywu group of women called Song Spirals, and that I found very useful in terms of thinking about this subject, about the uses of music among Australia's Indigenous peoples, and how very often, certainly for these Yolngu women, it embodies law. That music, song, is there not just to entertain, though it may do that too, but to store memories and to store information. And when we pass on songs, or when they pass on songs at any rate, they are passing on law, L-O-R-E and L-A-W, actually. And there's a connection there with Plato, who was very insistent that, that music was of the utmost importance for a society, and at one point proposed that the laws of the land be put to music. That's how important it was, that they should be enshrined in notes. So that, again, seems to be something which is universal. Maybe you can even sort of make an argument that today's teenagers listening to music on, their streaming service or whatever it is, are, if not, I mean, they're not learning laws exactly, but they are certainly learning a certain amount of lore, Lore. And as you used the word identity earlier on, I think perhaps at one level, most of us have our own music that we carry with us, which is part of our identity. And it might be a playlist, but it doesn't have to be. It might just be stuff that you remember.
Thinking about traditional music and reading what you've written about it strikes me as having a very sort of communal cultural role that relies very much, as you've said, on memory. It's an oral tradition, it's not written down, and it's always precarious in that sense about being passed on and evolving and changing. The role of notation beyond this sort of traditional music was a huge revolution, almost a technology, was it, of writing and capturing something that didn't rely on memory, that could be passed on in a written form through musical notation. This was a huge change, originating way back with a gentleman I think you called Guido. How did this happen, and how has this transformed our approach and understanding of music?
As you say, it does change music fundamentally, because if you don't have to remember it, then you can mess around with it, you can change it. If it's written down, then you can do something different next time. The thing about oral traditions is you've got to get the music right, or the story, or whatever it is you're passing on orally, the joke perhaps, which is really how oral traditions work in our world. If you've heard a joke and you thought it was very funny, you will want to tell somebody else, and you will try to remember it as accurately as possible. That's an oral tradition. But if it's written down, you don't have to remember it, you can consult it. And so what music notation gives us, and I should specify there's more than one sort of music notation, but what it does is that it stores up music. You can file it away, put it on a shelf, and it's there when you need it. So music notation doesn't begin with Guido. It's been going, as I mentioned, since about at least 3,500 years in ancient Mesopotamia. But the early forms of music notation, and some modern ones as well, are to do with telling you where to put your fingers on an instrument. So tablature, so guitar tablature or ukulele tablature is completely, up to date. That's what guitarists very often read, and instruments around the world have their own different forms of tablature. But what Guido came up with, Guido of Arezzo, who was a Benedictine monk in the 11th century, was a way of writing down the actual music so that you could sing it. You can't really sing tablature. You look at tablature, you can't hear the music. But if you are experienced with Guido's system, you can pick up a score and you can hear it in your head. Now that's a way of actually showing the music itself rather than telling you how to go about producing it.
Yeah, so it's changing the very nature of the music. As you say, Andrew, it on the one hand constitutes a form of memory and passing on, but it's also, as you point out in your book, with the stories that are fascinating to read and the music that you instance, that it's a platform for innovation. And in particular, it enabled composers to work with very different forms and to change the nature of music. The introduction, classical music, ideas of melody and harmony and rhythm, all these things were explored and innovated with as a result of composers notating, weren't they?
Yes, because you can plan. You can be like an architect with a blueprint, and you can map out the piece that you want to write. And that's a completely new way of thinking about music. And you can make it complex. I mean, one of the examples I give in the book is of Thomas Tallis, a composer in Tudor England, who around about 1570 composed his motet Spem in Alium, which is in 40 parts. That's to say there are 40 voices, each of them doing something different and turning into this massive web of sound. And you can't improvise something like this. And even if you could, you wouldn't be able to do it the same way twice. But Tallis was able to plan it and to write it down so that we can still hear what he wrote. We can still hear his 40-part motet today because it's there to be sung. All you need is the 40 singers, give them their parts and off they go. That's an incredible development, not just in terms of the durability of the music, but also in terms of the ambition you can create huge things. Something like Mahler's Symphony of 1,000, for instance, is unthinkable without notation.
Yes, when you when you don't
that's
have
what
the
a Guinness is.
notation, yeah, you can't create that scale, obviously, which is so important to the development in the history of music. But it also, as well as changing the form of the music, changed the nature of the way people can listen to music and appreciate music. As you say, you tell the story of sheet music, which captured through notation and brought a whole new way of listening to music, didn't it?
Well, it did because you could do it in the home. And when we think of classical music, for instance, we assume, it's a concert. We imagine a concert hall. We imagine going to hear an orchestra or maybe a piano player or whatever it is in a concert hall. But public concert halls didn't exist until the 19th century. Before that, music happened in the home. That's to say, notated music. And it happened at a certain level in society. The composers themselves were very much tradesmen, and I mean tradesmen as well. But the people who bought the music were educated ladies in Vienna or London or Paris, and they would buy a new sonata by Haydn or a set of sonatas, and they would take them home in the way that you would take home the latest novel by Margaret Atwood or whoever. They would take these sonatas home and they would play them for their own amusement, and that was possible because of notation. And it was really, it established a kind of trade in music as well. The concert hall came later, and originally it was very much for the wealthy, for the nobility and the gentry, as Peter Salomon said in his advertisement for Haydn's concerts in London. But before very long, the concert halls got a bit bigger, and it was possible for anybody who was interested to pay on the door to go into a concert. And the music became increasingly democratic, I suppose.
It became more democratic. It changed the nature of the role in society of a musician, and particularly composers who can become stars in their own right, and eventually did, even with their performances. I'm speaking here on Oz Music Radio in the Northern Beaches, incidentally, with our guest, Andrew Ford. We're discussing his book, The Shortest History of Music. Andrew, yeah, so it changes the nature of this whole thing. We're talking here about democratization, but you also take up the theme of commercialization in a chapter about music for sale, because in a sense, music has always been tied up with performers, way back to buskers, as you point out, even in the early blues eras, where money has been an important component in musical performance, hasn't it?
Yes, well, it is. I mean, musicians have to live, have to eat. And so if they're going to have a job, which very many of them did and still do. I mean, as you just said, I have a radio show that I present. If I tried to live solely from composing, I'd probably be thinner than I am. So that's been a constant. But the aim, I suspect, of most musicians is to make a living from their music. And if, to use your example, you happen to be blind and African American and musically talented, then there are not many things you can do to earn a living besides being on a street corner in 1930s, the United States in the 1930s, and singing and hoping that people will drop some coins into your can. So that's a very concrete example of music for sale. But there are lots of others. And there's both earning a living as a musician, and then there's also the thing about music itself being a commodity. And those sonatas that I was mentioning that the ladies in Vienna bought, that's an example of that. But then closer to our time, there's also the sheet music business, which meant that popular songs, somebody like Stephen Foster, for example, who wrote I Dream of Jeannie and Camptown Races and numerous other famous parlor songs of the 19th century, was able to disseminate his work that way, and people were able to buy the sheet music and take it home and sing it round the piano. The piano is an important element here. It becomes itself democratized over the years because it stops being an instrument which is only in the homes of rich people. And I remember my grandparents in Liverpool in England, this would have been in the 1960s, 70s, they lived in a tiny 2 up, 2 down in what even if you're being generous, you would have to call a slum, though a well-scrubbed slum, or their house was. But even though they only had 2 rooms upstairs and 2 rooms downstairs, the front room was seldom gone into. And it had a piano in it. And I don't know where the piano came from. To my knowledge, nobody in the family could play a piano, but at some point somebody must have been able to, and there it was. And they were features of most people's homes, including, in this case, the home of somebody where my grandfather was unemployed much of the time, and when he wasn't, he was working on the docks. So I mean, they were not wealthy people by any stretch of the imagination, but they had a piano, and I think that's how popular music became popular until the advent of recordings.
There is a bit of a tendency these days, anyway, particularly with streaming services and platforms and online music, to regard music as free. People seem very reluctant to engage in the commercial side. They seem to expect it to be free and seem to resent paying for it, and goes along with it sort of an implicit view of the nature of the musician and the composer and the performer, that it's not a real job, it's not a thing, it's like a hobby. Although on the other hand, as you say, music has become such big business, and that's been driven by technology, hasn't it? And particularly the impact of sound recording on the nature of music and the role of musicians.
Yes, I mean, sound recording can only be a good thing. It enables us to hear a wide range of music, and it makes it available in a way which it had never been available before. I think I say in the book that if you had been born 120 years ago, you would have been lucky to hear every Beethoven symphony. There are only 9 of them. You would have been lucky to hear every one once in your lifetime. You'd have to have lived in a city. You'd have to have gone to concerts to hear. You'd have to have heard them live. There wouldn't have been any other way to hear them unless you bought piano reduction and played it for yourself. But that's not quite the same thing. And in that short period of time, just not much more than a century, anybody can hear a Beethoven symphony whenever they want. We can even hear them now by accident. You get in the car, the radio happens to be on, and there's a Beethoven symphony, for example. So that's changed. It's made music much more convenient, and streaming makes it more convenient still. But at the same time, it devalues it, I think. There is no effort involved now. You just click, and if you can't get what you want from clicking, you feel somehow aggrieved. Why can't I hear this? And maybe after a couple of minutes, you think, oh, actually, I'd rather hear this. So I think that the experience of listening to music courtesy of streaming is devalued. And it's not just that musicians are being ripped off, which we are, and finding it harder to make a living than before. I think the listeners are being ripped off too, because I think they're hearing music which is not very good quality in terms of its sound, if you're listening on your phone. And also the experience of listening is actually degraded. So that's the trade-off for the convenience, and I'm not sure it's a good deal.
Yeah, this commercialization through the sound recording technologies, of course, of music into a big business, a global industry, raises all sorts of issues, as well as the access issues, which are good, and the scale of music that's now available. But it maybe poses questions too about artistic control and the returns that the artists get from this big business. Although it has introduced recording technology, as you discuss in your chapter on modernism, the ability for musicians to be very innovative and disruptive and original through notation and recording. This is a big story, isn't it, of the impact of modernism in the 20th century?
Yes, I mean, that's where we situate modernism usually. And what we mean by modernism is composers who sort of overturn the nature of music, who come up with something completely new. Stravinsky's a good example. If we take a piece like The Rite of Spring, who does away with the sort of 4-bar phrases which have been in use for a long time and smashes it up and rebuilds it a bit like a mosaic, so that the music is made up of tiny little cells of different sizes, so that you get this sort of jagged kind of rhythm, which is very exciting, but it's not the kind of approach to rhythm which we had had for a couple of hundred years before that. And likewise, in The Rite of Spring, he decides that he doesn't need to use tonality in the way it's always been used. He can stay on one chord for a very long time. The music doesn't have to progress in any sense from a harmonic point of view. That's sort of what we mean by modernism. I mean, there are lots of other examples as well I could give, but that's a good example. But there have been composers throughout history, or at least since notation, who have done something very similar, who have come up with something absolutely new that's not been done before, that have changed the nature of music. And if we go back through history, well, we have to mention Wagner, for instance, who did something rather similar with harmony, stretching it incredibly and turning it into something much more expressive than it had been before. Beethoven's a good example of somebody who came up with a different kind of music, a different attitude to music, and on and on. Monteverdi, even going back as far as the 12th century to the composers of the School of Notre Dame and their approach to rhythm, but also to writing in more than one voice, or Hildegard of Bingen, whose music took on an amazingly melodic feel that really hadn't been there before. Vocal music before Hildegard spanned maybe 4 or 5 notes, and Hildegard stretched it. Some of her pieces go over 2 octaves. I mean, that's a completely different way of looking at it. Really radical. I mean, if you're in the 12th century, it's radical. It doesn't seem radical to us, but you would have been knocked sideways hearing that music.
Yes, there's innovation and development has always been an important part. Technology has impacted on that. Not only the form, as we've said, but the nature of music itself and musicians and their role. And recording technology, as you write too, tell the story, has transformed people's way they listen and the creative process, in the sense that music might have moved from performance through to notation and duplication and stuff, but recording in the studio now with the technologies available has been turned into an art form itself. It's not a live performance, and yet it's an innovative, creative form of recording, isn't it, that allows an artist to explore music in a much deeper way and listeners to appreciate music in a much deeper way.
Yeah, I mean, recording is a way, I mean, the fact that it's called a record, it was a way of preserving this music, of making a record of it. But it's also something that can be used by composers or musicians in the studio. So if you take somebody like Miles Davis, for instance, in the late 1960s and early 70s, he goes from being a jazz trumpeter with a quintet that gets out there and plays and improvises based on certain set patterns, certain compositions, chords in a certain order or a mode. He goes from that to going into the studio with a lot of musicians, many of them playing now electric instruments, electric guitar, electronic organ, and they record, and then they go home, and then Miles and his producer, Tio Macero, start cutting it up and putting it together and actually creating In a Silent Way or Bitches Brew or one of those albums. But they do it via editing. So the technology is part of the creative process, and the resulting record is down to Miles and Teo more than it is the musicians like Herbie Hancock and Wayne Shorter who provided the original materials. The actual final structure is not their doing, it's the producers.
It's been a real pleasure talking to you and a huge pleasure reading your book. And as you say at the end, this is a story of continual of change and innovation and technology and commercialization. But there is a strong element of continuity, all this. And I think you induce from this that although some things have been lost and some things have been gained, you believe that the underlying fundamentals of music stay the same. Although, as you concede, you never really set out to define music, but to explore it in a very, let's say, inductive manner. So thank you very much for joining us here on Radio Northern Beaches Oz Music, Andrew Ford.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks for reading the book so closely too.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. we've got the world's best beer. But most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3, now hitting the entire world on www.rmb.org.au.